In the early years of World War II, long before the tides of the Atlantic shifted, the cold waters between North America and Europe had already transformed into a deadly, silent battlefield. Ships that once carried ordinary cargo now moved like targets across thousands of lonely miles, constantly hunted by shadows beneath the waves. Those shadows were the German U-boats, sleek, steel predators, commanded by confident, often celebrated captains who believed they held the power to choke off the Allied war machine. And for a time, they were right. From 1939 to 1942, the men who commanded these submarines were seen as heroes of the Third Reich. Their successes were glorified in newspapers, their photographs printed in magazines, medals pinned to their chests. To the German people, these captains were knights beneath the sea. To the Allies, they were ghosts, silent destroyers capable of striking without warning. They sank merchant ship after merchant ship, leaving burning wrecks drifting across the Atlantic. This era became known as the happy time for the U-boat fleet, a period when Allied defenses were weak, scattered, and confused. But history rarely allows one side to dominate for long. Slowly, quietly, the Allies were learning. New technology was emerging, strategies were changing, and soon something was coming across the Atlantic, something the German U-boat captains never expected, something that would shock them to their core. It was a new American idea, a new American creation, known simply as the hunter-killer groups. These groups were unlike anything the U-boats had ever faced. They didn't wait defensively around convoys. They didn't follow predictable patterns. They didn't hesitate. They hunted. To understand why this shocked the German captains so deeply, you have to understand how the Atlantic War began. In the early stages, the Allies relied on traditional convoy systems. Merchant or troop ships would travel together, surrounded by British or Canadian escorts. Destroyers and corvettes would circle them like nervous shepherds guarding a flock. Their mission was simple: keep the convoy alive. But this was a reactionary method. It responded to danger. It did not prevent it. The U-boats exploited this weakness without mercy. The U-boats did not need to sink everything. They only needed to sink enough. If they could destroy millions of tons of cargo, oil, food, steel, ammunition, they could starve Britain, weaken the Soviets, and cripple any hope of an Allied victory. U-boats would wait, silently tracking convoys, then rise like steel sharks at night. Radar was weak, sonar was limited, and the dark ocean hid everything. For the Allies, the Atlantic became a graveyard. But American strategists began to ask a question that would change the war. Why defend when you can attack? Why wait for submarines to come to you when you could go to them? This was the seed of the hunter-killer idea, a concept built not on defense, but on pursuit. A hunter-killer group centered around a single escort carrier. These were small, fast carriers capable of launching aircraft specifically designed to find submarines. Around the carrier sailed destroyers and destroyer escorts, forming a lethal ring ready to strike above and below the surface. Their mission: roam the Atlantic freely, find U-boats, and destroy them before they could even approach a convoy. For German commanders trained in rigid patterns of naval logic, this was pure chaos. They were no longer fighting a predictable enemy. They were facing a hunter. By 1943, the transformation was complete. The Atlantic had changed. It was no longer a battlefield of opportunity for the U-boats. It was becoming a trap. The hunter-killer groups moved quickly, using intelligence, radar, new sonar, and long-range aircraft. The U-boats that once stalked the sea now found themselves stalked. Their captains, once confident and fearless, now wrote in their war diaries about a new kind of terror. They described aircraft appearing seemingly out of nowhere. They recorded moments where the ocean itself felt hostile, as if the Americans could see through the waves. The shock came not in a single battle, but in the realization that their dominance had evaporated. U-boats that surfaced at night, believing darkness was their ally, suddenly found American aircraft already circling U-boats that tried to hide deep underwater, heard the unmistakable sound of destroyers closing in. The Germans had never imagined that aircraft could coordinate so precisely with surface ships, or that American attacks would be so relentless, so fast, so well-informed. This shift didn't happen by luck. It was built on code-breaking, improved radar, high-frequency direction finding, and American willingness to innovate. The hunter-killer groups represented a mindset change. Instead of fearing the U-boats, the Allies began to pursue them. Many German captains later admitted that the shock was immediate and overwhelming. They had believed that American crews were inexperienced, undisciplined, and technologically behind the British. But when the hunter-killer groups entered the war, those illusions vanished. The Americans weren't only catching up, they were surpassing expectations. Every tactic the U-boats attempted was answered with something new. Faster reactions, broader patrol ranges, smarter coordination. The hunter had become the hunted, and for the first time since the war began, the U-boat captains realized the ocean no longer belonged to them. As the U-boats retreated deeper and deeper into the Atlantic, they discovered that there were no safe zones left. The air patrols were longer. The sonar was sharper, the destroyers were faster, and the code breakers were listening to everything. Slowly, terrifyingly, the German captains began to understand what was happening. The Americans weren't protecting convoys anymore. They were eliminating threats, one submarine at a time. The psychological impact of this was immense. U-boat crews started each patrol with anxiety, unsure if they would even return home. The oceans they once ruled had turned against them. This was the beginning of the end for Germany's U-boat force. The hunter-killer groups had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same again. As 1943 progressed, the German U-boat captains began to experience something they had never felt before. A sense of creeping vulnerability in waters they once considered their hunting ground. The Atlantic, once wide and empty, now felt alive with unseen dangers. Every wave could hide a destroyer. Every cloud might conceal an aircraft. It wasn't just the physical threat that wore down the U-boat crews, it was the psychological pressure. The ocean had become unpredictable, hostile, and filled with eyes. The Americans were not simply escorting convoys anymore. They were sweeping entire regions of the Atlantic, sometimes areas that had no shipping at all. German intelligence couldn't understand why U-boats were being found so easily. Captains wrote in frustrated letters that the Americans seemed to track them even when they used strict radio silence. Little did they know that Allied code breakers at Bletchley Park, combined with American HF/DF technology, were guiding the hunter-killer groups with uncanny accuracy. One of the major turning points came with the arrival of the escort carrier USS Bogue and her accompanying destroyers. The Bogue group, operating with precise coordination, became a nightmare for German submarines. Aircraft launched from the carrier could cover vast areas, detecting snorkels, wakes, or periscopes with radar that had grown frighteningly accurate. Meanwhile, destroyer escorts moved like wolves, ready to pounce the moment a submarine was detected. U-boat commanders quickly realized that the Americans were no longer reacting. They were anticipating. When a submarine dove to escape aircraft, the Bogue's destroyers were already converging on that location. When a submarine surfaced at night to recharge its batteries, radar-equipped Avengers and Wildcats were waiting. Captains were stunned by the speed and coordination. They had never seen an enemy operate with such seamless integration between air and sea forces. Another deadly group formed around the escort carrier, USS Card. This group entered the dreaded Mid-Atlantic Gap, the so-called Black Pit, where U-boats had once felt relatively safe due to lack of air coverage. That region had earned its name because merchant ships crossing it often vanished without warning, victims of unseen U-boats lurking beneath. But once the Card's aircraft began patrolling the gap, the tide turned almost overnight. German submarines that surfaced in the Black Pit suddenly found themselves illuminated by searchlights or attacked by rockets and depth charges. For U-boat crews, it was terrifying. There had never been aircraft this far out at sea before. The ocean that once protected them now betrayed them. The shock was even deeper because German doctrine had been built around assumptions that were now obsolete. They believed night was their ally. They believed the mid-Atlantic was unreachable by enemy aircraft. They believed the Americans relied mainly on convoys and had limited patrol radius. Every one of these beliefs collapsed. The hunter-killer groups exploited this collapse fully. Captains began to describe encounters where they surfaced in pitch darkness, only to be met by aircraft within minutes. They recounted moments where their sonar detected multiple destroyers closing in rapidly, almost as if the Americans had been waiting for them. Some reported being hunted for hours, forced to remain submerged as their batteries drained dangerously low. They understood that surfacing meant death, but staying under meant suffocation and power loss. It was a choice between two lethal options. Morale inside the submarines plummeted. The once proud U-boat arm, which had been hailed as Germany's decisive weapon, now found itself facing an enemy that adapted faster than they could respond. Stories spread among crews about submarines that disappeared without a trace, struck down by hidden aircraft or relentless destroyers. New recruits, once eager to join the elite submarine service, were now filled with dread before their first patrol even began. One captain, reflecting after the war, said, "It felt as if the Americans had turned the ocean against us. We were no longer hunters. We were prey, fleeing from shadows that always found us." This feeling was shared across the fleet. The U-boat captains realized that their tactics, once effective and feared, were now predictable. The Allies knew their playbook. Technological advancements also widened the gap. American aircraft dropped sonobuoys, floating sensors that listened for submarine propellers underwater. Radar became strong enough to detect even a small periscope breaking the surface. And depth charges were replaced or supported by ahead-thrown weapons like Hedgehog, which launched a spread of explosives in front of the ship, giving submarines even less time to escape. The coordination was astonishing. Aircraft would force a U-boat to dive. The moment it submerged, destroyers rushed in, creating a deadly net of sonar pings and depth charge patterns. Submarines found themselves trapped, hunted in 3 dimensions, unable to rely on stealth or darkness. Even when U-boats tried to attack the escort carriers themselves, the results were disastrous. Out of desperation, German command ordered submarines to form wolf packs, not against convoys, but against hunter-killer groups. It was a fatal mistake. The escort carriers were protected by destroyers that reacted instantly to any threat. Aircraft orbited constantly. Every torpedo launch risked immediate counterattack. U-boats sent on these missions often did not return. Those that did reported overwhelming resistance, as if they had challenged an enemy with infinite eyes and ears. The Americans were also becoming increasingly aggressive. Rather than merely disabling submarines, they aimed to destroy them completely, knowing each U-boat lost was a blow to German morale and resources. When intelligence suggested a wolf pack was forming, the hunter-killer groups moved in like predators, following blood in the water. Sinkings increased rapidly one by one. Pack leaders were killed or forced to retreat. The wolf packs, once the terror of the Atlantic, were dismantled piece by piece. Inside Germany, the shock waves were felt at the highest levels. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, realized that the war at sea was slipping from his hands. He pushed for new submarine designs, the faster, deadlier Type 21 and Type 23, but these arrived too late. The hunter-killer groups had broken the back of the submarine campaign long before advanced models reached the battlefield. The final years of the war were devastating for U-boat crews. Survival rates dropped so low that new recruits were statistically unlikely to return from their first patrol. Some crews spent weeks without seeing a single ship to attack, yet lived under constant fear of detection. The Americans were no longer guarding supply routes. They were extinguishing the U-boat threat entirely. What made the hunter-killer group so shocking was not only their firepower, but the change in mentality they represented. They proved that wars are not won by standing still, they are won by adapting, innovating, and seizing initiative. The German captains, who once viewed the Atlantic as their domain, suddenly found themselves facing an enemy that understood the ocean better than they did. By the time the war ended, it was clear that America's hunter-killer groups had played a decisive role in securing victory in the Atlantic. They shattered the myth of the invincible U-boat fleet, restored safety to Allied shipping, and demonstrated the power of coordinated warfare. For the German captains who survived, the memory of those relentless hunters, the aircraft in the night, the destroyers that appeared from nowhere, the sonar that never stopped echoing, remained with them long after the war was over. In the end, the shock felt by the U-boat captains was not just about technology or tactics. It was about the realization that the ocean they once ruled had turned against them. The hunters had become the hunted, and America's hunter-killer groups had rewritten the very nature of the Battle of the Atlantic.